everyone. Welcome to the Farmhouse Gathering. This is our second episode, and tonight on the porch we have Annie from 15 Acre Homestead. We have Kathy from Oak Hill Homestead. I'm Julie from the Farm Life. And last but not least is Shauna with Homegrown Self-Reliance. Tonight we are talking about composting, that beautiful black gold in the garden. And Shauna's going to kick us off. She is going to be talking about, Shauna, is she there?
Hey guys, so today I'm talking about testing and amending your soil. Am I there?
You're here.
Okay. My internet's a little splotchy, and I'm sorry, I got chickens crowing in the backyard. So you really need to test your soil before you start planting anything. The soil health is directly correlated to the health of your veggies that you grow in the soil. If you've never done it before, you can buy soil test kits. They test things like pH, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. You can also just test your composition to find out the amount of sand, silt, and clay that's in your soil. Ideally, you want like a pretty close balance of the three. That's when you have the best soil possible. So here's like my favorite way to test it. Let me see if I can screen share a little bit here, or show you my video anyways. So this is not my soil. It is some that I bought. It's just normal garden soil, but it's got manure and compost added to it. It's pretty good soil. So what you do on these tests is you fill the jar with about halfway with your soil. If the jar has straight sides, it's easiest to measure. So you fill it halfway with your soil, and then you fill it almost all the way to the top. Let it sit for about 5 minutes, and then your sand will be at the very bottom. So you can mark it with a marker. I've got it somewhere here, but I can't see it. This one is pretty close to being perfect soil. This one, on the other hand, is mean. It has a ton of sand and quite a bit of clay too. So I'm sorry, going back to the actual test. So if you wait 5 minutes, then the sand will be at the bottom. You mark it, and then you let it sit again for about 2 hours, and then your silt will be on top of the sand. And mark that level too. And then if you wait 24 hours without shaking this or doing anything with it, the clay will be on top of that, and of course mark that too. And you see this one has very little, but a little floating on top are the organic matter. This one actually has more than mine, but still not a great amount. It was better, but it's been sitting out for a couple days, so it's kind of settled some more. But that is about the best way to test the soil composition without actually sending it off for a sample. You can send it off to a sample at like the local cooperative extension. Costs a little bit of money, but that'll actually give you a really good snapshot of your soil health. It'll give you actual percentages and everything of the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potash, and It'll also give you a good indicator of your pH too. Your ideal soil pH is in between 6 and 7. About 6.5 is ideal. Most veggies grow the best at that level. If you have low pH, your soil is acidic and you need to add lime or dolomite or fireplace ashes to bring that level up. If you have high pH, it's more than 7, it is alkaline, and you can add sulfur, peat moss, compost, or manure to help bring that level down. Compost is a wonderful way to amend your soil. It adds organic matter that your plants need to thrive, and it's also usually really good for the nitrogen content and the phosphorus content. Some of the macronutrients that soil needs is nitrogen, which helps facilitate photosynthesis, and it helps your plants grow properly and yield the fruit that it needs to yield. Compost, once again, is a good for that. I use compost all the time. And corn, squash, cabbage, and broccoli actually a lot of nitrogen, where some other crops don't need so much. So that's going to depend on what you're growing as well, as far as the amount that you need in there. And peas, legumes, and beans are actually nitrogen fixing. So they take the nitrogen from the air and they fix it into the soil. So after you've grown a crop that takes a lot of nitrogen, it's a good idea to plant peas or beans to put some nitrogen into the soil. Phosphorus is another macronutrient that your plants need. It provides energy to the plant and encourages the bloom and healthy root growth. If your soil is lacking in phosphorus, you can add rock phosphate or bone meal. Sorry, I've got some notes here to make sure I'm talking about everything I wanted to cover. Potassium is another important one. It helps regulate the plant's ability to take in carbon dioxide. If your soil lacks potassium, your plants will be yellow and they'll have stunted growth. You can increase that by making banana peel tea, where you just soak banana peels in some water and then you water your plants with that. Or fireplace ashes is a good addition for that also, and kelp meal. Basically, the best thing to keep in mind with your soil is it's all about balance. You don't want too much of one nutrient and too little of another one. It'll throw the balance off and your plants won't grow to their full potential. And you can read more about soil health on my site. And if you have any questions, just let me know.
Okay, Kathy, well, she was talking about compost. How exactly do we build our compost pile? What can we use and what can't we?
Okay. My ground is mostly clay. So one of the best things that I can do for it is to make compost to add into the soil that I have so that it it gives the plants room to grow their roots. Clay, of course, compacts, and then there isn't room for the roots to grow. So it's an excellent addition. And I just build my compost pile on the ground. I know a lot of people use bins or tumblers or various different things, but I just put it right on the ground. It's just easier for me that way. I don't have to worry about it being too wet. When it rains, the water just goes off into the ground and it doesn't get soaked. It doesn't get soggy. As for what you can put in your compost, anything that isn't man-made, but that isn't, I mean, you have to consider, you could put toothpicks in your compost. They're man-made, but they're made out of wood, which is natural. So you don't want plastic, you don't want metal, polyester, any of that sort of stuff. You don't want that in there. You want items that are from nature. So somebody asked in our group if she could put in the wood shavings with chicken manure in it. And yes, you can. That's an excellent compost starter. That's a really hot material, and it'll really get your compost cooking in there. Grass clippings is another great one. I use a lot of grass clippings in mine. You do have to be careful not to put in a thick layer of those because it mats together and then it just gets kind of nasty. So use thin layers of grass clippings. You want a good balance of greens and browns. Greens are the ones that are full of nitrogen, like the grass clippings and kitchen waste, some other things. And the browns are those wood shavings, paper, newspaper, fibers. You can put pet hair in your compost pile, which is really nice this time of year. Go out there, I brush the horses and get this whole big pile of white hair that my one horse sheds every spring, and it goes in the compost pile. Leaves in the fall, when they fall off the trees, I rake them all up. I throw them in a leaky water trough that I can't put water in anymore, and I save those for the rest of the year. Straw is better than hay because hay has weed seeds in it and straw doesn't. And that's a brown again. Manure is usually a green, high in nitrogen. But the nice thing about that is too, if you clean out the chicken coop and you've got the wood shavings and the manure, there's your greens and your browns right there in the same, you only have to work once to get both, which is really nice. Clean out a horse stall or the goat shed, and it's got the bedding, whether it's straw or sawdust or shavings or whatever. And then with the manure, again, that's, a good balance of both. And in fact, I have done this, clean out the goat shed, make a big pile of it over in the corner, and then walk away and leave it for about 3 years. By the time you come back in 3 years, it's really, really nice compost. But you can do it much faster if you plan it, if you add other things to it in a manner that balances everything out. If you turn it occasionally, if you give it enough water and enough air, and you can have compost in sometimes as little as a month, usually a little bit longer than that, but you can make it go pretty fast. So that's pretty much it. Just as long as the items you want to put in it, kitchen waste, when you're canning, any of the fruit peels and the apple cores and all that kind of stuff can go in there. Dinner leftovers, although you're not supposed to put meat in, but if there's a bite of chicken on the plate, I don't pull it out. Some people don't use dairy products. I do. Container of yogurt in the refrigerator that got moldy, that goes in there too. So as long as it is the main ingredient or the ingredients in whatever it is natural, if it came from nature, even if it's been turned into something by man, as long as it has those natural ingredients, that's what you want to put in your compost pile.
Well, Kathy was talking about the different bins and stuff, and some of us actually would love to have compost, but we live in an apartment or a condo, or our yards are so small and our neighbors are so close, we really don't have room to do a big pile. When you have that situation, you can do a thing called mini compost bins. I've done a little PowerPoint presentation, very short, but this will kind of give you an idea of how to do them. You start off with going to the dollar store or to Walmart, and you find some of these plastic bins like this. If you'll notice, they have holes in them, which contribute to the drainage. You need a few supplies, and if it will come up, you need 3 plastic crates. You need 1/4 to 1/2 inch hardware cloth. You're going to have wire cutters, and you really need gloves when you go to cutting hardware cloth. It's hard on your hands. A measuring tape and some small gauge wire. What you do is you cut 5 pieces. You measure the bottom and all 4 sides. You cut wire to fit. Once you've got it cut, take that small gauge wire and you can twist it around to hold your wire in place. Once you've done that, You start loading it up. Load it with your scraps, your straw, whatever you need. Once you've gotten your first bin filled, you give it about 2 or 3 weeks to let it start breaking down. Then you take it and you turn it into your second bin. Start filling your first bin. Give it at least 2 to 3 weeks, 4 weeks if necessary for it to start breaking down. Bin 2 goes into bin 3. Bin 1 goes into bin 2, and you start filling up bin 1 again. After about 4 weeks or so, your bin 3 should be completely broken down. At that point, you can start adding it to your containers or whatever. Keep in mind, when you do mini compost bins, you're not going to have that full bin full of compost. It breaks down, and by the time it's broken down, you have a nice handful. So you can either go ahead and use that. One of the things when I was using mini bins is we have a larger tub. You can use a 5-gallon bucket. We use a big black tub that minerals come in. Take your finished compost, pour it in there, and then just keep doing this. If you start building your compost in the summer or fall, you keep building up and adding to that bin over the winter. Then when you're ready to plant in the spring, you're going to have an accumulation of compost to use in any garden that's larger. Feed it to your containers, raised beds, whatever you want to do. So if you don't have a large space, consider mini compost bins. I have a post on step-by-step on how to make it on the site, and you're going to find all of these great posts at the end of the YouTube channel. If you want to try a different kind of composting, see what Annie has to say about it.
Well, mine is on vermicomposting, which is using worms instead of just food scraps. Basically, with composting, you're building a pile. You're adding your food scraps, as Kathy said, your meats, your yogurts, your food waste, your yard scraps, and you're letting the heat and the moisture build up, which breaks down all of that food and turns it into compost, which, Julie, you're doing with a smaller version. Well, with vermicomposting, instead of the heat and the water breaking down your food scraps and your yard scraps, you're using worms to break down those same scraps. Most people start or think of vermicomposting, they think of small bins. And that's fine. You can absolutely do that. You can use a Rubbermaid tote, 20 or 25 gallon Rubbermaid tote. You can put some holes in the bottom. You could throw in some shredded newspaper, a little bit of dirt or compost, throw your worms in there, put some food in there, food scraps, close the lid for 24 hours. The next day you take the lid off and basically you just let them do their thing. Every week you just add some food to that bin. However, I don't recommend you doing it in a bin. You can, and I know that that's like the traditional way of doing it, but you don't need to. Those worms can go directly into your raised beds. They can go directly into your gardens. Everybody worries that the worms are going to leave, and that is not true. Worms will stay as long as they can eat, they have water, and they have moisture. One of the things to beware of with vermicomposting is heat. And that's a big thing that everybody asks about. Worms do not like it super hot. If the sun is baking your bin or baking your compost pile, if the temperature is too high, the worms will absolutely leave. And I'm going to tell you that even in a bin, if it gets too hot, the worms will die or they will crawl out if they can. My recommendation is instead of adding your food scraps to your bin, you can add your food scraps directly to your garden bin. Now, if you live in a residential neighborhood, I'm sure the neighbors do not like you putting your watermelon rinds all over your front yard. So you can still use them, just cut them up smaller, which you have to do with vermicomposting anyway. Worms' mouths are not like ours. They cannot chew a watermelon rind like we can. So you have to either put it into a blender and make it like a slurry or a slushy for them, or you can chop it up into fine pieces. But If you spread it out over your garden and then you cover it with a layer of mulch, it's going to go down in the ground. The worms are going to come up and get it, and they're going to stay in that garden bed. You don't have to worry about them leaving. If you choose to start a bed, my suggestion is to start with a 20 or 25 gallon tote, drill the holes like I said, throw some shredded newspaper and some dirt in there, give it a little bit of water, and add some worms. Once that bed starts producing castings, which is basically worm poop, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you it's easy. It is a pain in the butt to get it out of there. By doing it directly on the ground, those castings stay right where you want them to go. They don't go anywhere. They don't get washed away. They stay right there in the beds where they need to be. One of the differences, though, between composting and vermicomposting is, like Kathy said, you can add milk products or maybe a small piece of chicken, things like that. If you're going to use vermicomposting and if you're going to use worms in your beds, you cannot use certain things. You cannot do milk. You cannot do salt. You cannot do cooked food or dairy of any kind. Bones, oils, greases, any kind of pet poop, which a lot of people throw in there, and that includes chicken and goat and all manure. You just can't put that in there. You can put a little bit, but not a lot, because the worms will not do it. They don't want to eat the very thing that they're in the bin to do, basically, is how to look at it. So I wouldn't add those kind of things. You can do melon rinds. You can do citrus fruits. You can do squash. Any kind of the fleshy vegetable fruits can go in there. Pasta, rice, anything that is normal that doesn't have a lot of salt or seasonings to it can be added to a vermicomposting bed. Less favorable for them are onions, garlic, and believe it or not, bread. I don't recommend bread in a vermicomposting bin. And the reason that I say is bread molds very easy when it gets wet. And you don't have the heat in a vermicomposting bed that you would in a compost bin. So it's not going to break down as quickly. And worms cannot eat fast. You only feed a vermicomposting bin once a week, and that's only as much as they can eat. So by putting bread in there, it tends to get moldy, and then the worms will leave because worms don't want the mold. All right, so that's like a big no-no as far as that goes. As far as if you're going to start a bin, nobody knows how many worms to get. And the rule of thumb is to put a container on your counter with a little bag in it. All of the food scraps that you know that worms can eat, dump into that container, and each day weigh the bag. So if it weighs, a half a pound one day and a half a pound the next day, add those weights up over a period of 7 days. The total amount of weight of food scraps that you got rid of is what you're going to use to know how many worms you need. So for every 1 pound of food scraps, you need 1,000 worms. Now that sounds like a lot of worms, but it takes a lot to get a pound of food scraps, believe it or not. So if you have 2 pounds of food scraps, you need 4 pounds of worms. And like I said, a pound of worms is about 1,000. Now you do not need to order 1,000 worms. They come by pound. You can order them online at Amazon. Red worms are the best, but you can use any kind of worms. I'm in Florida. I do not order red worms. We have these weird earthworm looking segmented worms that do wonders. And I simply just add them and keep adding them and keep adding them and keep adding them. And when I dig down in that vermicomposting and it seems like I'm getting more worms than I am compost or castings, I just take a handful of worms and I throw them right in my garden bed, throw some dirt over them. And I promise you 3 months later, when I dig them up, there's still worms in that compost bed because I throw my scraps and my things in there. The last thing that I want to add is that most people are afraid of what kind of containers to use. If you do choose to use a container, you can use a Rubbermaid tote, which I really don't recommend at all. You can use a cooler, a styrofoam cooler, because it keeps the temperature pretty regular. You can use an old garbage can. I use an old bathtub. Now I have 15 acres and I don't recommend you putting an old bathtub that came out of somebody's house in the middle of your yard. Your neighbors do not like that look, I promise you. Ours are hidden in the back. And as far as heat, if you're in a place like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, California, Texas, Florida, where we get that high, real intense heat in the summer, I don't recommend you putting your worm beds in where that heat can shine directly on it. I would keep it in a shaded area. It's external temperature is what matters. You can vermicompost year round. You can put them inside a greenhouse, in a garage. You can even put a small bin on a heating mat like you would use to start seeds if it's that important to keep over the summer. And lastly, keep in mind that vermicomposting is it's more of a long-term, it's very slow process and you don't get a lot from it. Not if you have to keep cleaning it and changing it out and all. You're really better off starting them on the ground or in the ground in raised beds and so forth until you get the hang of it. If you want more information, I've got a huge post on my site of how to get started. And there's even one on there about how to harvest your bins if you choose to use bins.
Well, I'm going to have to beg to differ with Annie on one thing. Me personally, I would love to see a pink painted clawfoot bathtub in the middle of every residential yard. They make the cutest flower beds. But I can tell you, not everybody thinks like I do. So, well, we've come to the end of this segment, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation on the Farmhouse Gathering porch. If you have any questions, you can drop by the Facebook group. Go ahead and ask them. Or by tomorrow afternoon, we should have the YouTube video up. Watch it, ask your questions underneath, and we'll be sure to get back with you. Now, next week, we're going to be talking about all those seeds you need for your garden. We're going to talk about where you can find them, the different types you can use. Kathy's going to talk to us about lettuce seeds and actually growing enough to make a blend. And Annie's going to have some real fun do-it-yourself tips. So, we are looking forward to seeing y'all next week. Make sure you drop by the porch for a visit. And until then, grab your lemonade, relax, and enjoy life. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. See you next week.